Hello everyone, my name is Andrew and welcome back to Frames of Space. If you have ever heard of the phrase the end of history, it's probably because of today's guest, Francis Fukuyama. Now here's the quick version. After the end of the Cold War, Fukuyama argued that liberal democracy had won, and its victory was not just military or economic terms, but in ideological terms as well. His argument was that communism had collapsed under its own contradictions, fascism had been defeated decades earlier, and no serious alternative remained. His thesis was not that nothing would ever happen again, but that liberal democracy represented the final stage in humanity's ideological development, not perfect, but unmatched in its own legitimacy and staying power. Now, the argument was not that history literally stopped or that nothing bad ever happens again. It was more that the ideological battle over what kind of regime is best had more or less been settled. And in many ways, that thesis shaped the mood of the 1990s, the belief that history was moving in one direction and that liberal democracy, despite its flaws, would continue to spread. But now, in 2025, it's hard not to ask, was that wrong? Or at least premature? That's what I wanted to explore in this episode. Because we're not just seeing democratic decline in fragile states anymore, we're seeing it in the United States. We're watching political institutions decay and populist movements openly threaten core democratic norms. And yet, Fukuyama continues to remain a staunch defender of liberal democracy and of the rule of law, and especially a staunch defender of free speech. So I wanted to press him on this. How does he square his original thesis with the types of authoritarian energy that we're seeing today? How does the rise of China and its autocratic government, does that represent a serious ideological alternative? And what do you do when democracy becomes so dysfunctional that people begin longing for something, anything, that simply gets things done? So this is a conversation about the case for liberal democracy and why we should still fight for it, because it's worth defending. And there's a lot that we risk losing if we don't defend it. Now here's my conversation with Francis Fukuyama. Hope you enjoy. All right. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Francis Fukuyama, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
So I guess my first question is, obviously, I'm sure that people tell you this every single week, but you are known for your book on the end of history. On a scale from 0 to 10, how much have you revised your own positions about this in the past 30 years?
Well, I'm not going to put a number on it. I wrote a 2-volume series, The Origins of Political Order and Political Decay, which I regard basically as a rewriting of the end of history and the last man. And there's other areas where, I've changed the positions I took. I mean, the major revisions that are in the Political Order series are really two concepts. So the first is that when I wrote The End of History and the Last Man, I did not understand the importance of having a modern impersonal state for political development. And that's something that I really focused on in the two Political Order books. And the other major revision had to do with the concept of political decay, which really didn't appear in the earlier book. And especially now in the United States, I think it's pretty clear that we have decayed, and the idea that you can go backwards as well as forwards, I think should be pretty well established at this point.
Yeah. All right. So maybe let's start out with a little bit of maybe some context. how do you describe the end of history? What does that phrase mean to you?
Well, it's not my phrase in the first place. This was a phrase used by the philosopher Hegel. He was the first historicist philosopher, and he argued that history with a capital H, what we would now call development or modernization, was directional and progressive. And I think that most people still believe some version of that. And the question of the end of history was, what was the direction or the endpoint towards which human societies seemed to be evolving? Karl Marx picked up the idea of the end of history from Hegel, and he asserted that the end of history was not Hegel's liberal state, it was rather a communist utopia. And the argument I was making in the end of history was that Marx seemed to be wrong, that there was not a further stage of human development beyond liberal democracy and a market economy, but rather the Hegelian end of history appeared to be where we were really heading. And I think that in many ways, that's still a correct understanding, although, we can debate a lot about the state of the current world.
Yeah. All right. I want to quote your book right now. So just to quote your introduction, you say, quote, "I argued that liberal democracy may constitute the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the final form of human government, and as such constituted the end."
By the way, that doesn't come from the book. That's from the original article.
Yeah. But basically your argument is that while earlier forms of government like communism or fascism were characterized by grave defects and irrationalities that led to their eventual collapse, liberal democracy was arguably free from such contradictions. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I think that that's a position that's a little bit harder to take at the moment with the kind of political decay you've seen in democracies like the United States. But essentially, I have a kind of Darwinian view of political development, which is that you have different political forms. They do well for their citizens or they don't. And if they don't do well, then they're replaced by other forms. So if you go to the political order books, it's really about the development and the evolution of a modern state, as well as rule of law and democracy, and why, how they first came about and how they proved to be superior to, other existing forms. So hunter-gatherer societies are replaced by societies organized into segmentary lineages. It turns out that state-level societies are superior in most respects to tribal societies, so they replace tribal societies at a certain point. You have different forms of state-level society, and those that have liberal institutions beginning, in the early modern period turn out to be much more superior in economic terms, because liberal societies that guarantee property rights, contract enforcement turned out to be much richer than authoritarian societies in which wealth was concentrated in a small elite. And so you see this progressive replacement of one form of government by another. And I think, I still, the argument that I tried to make beginning in 1989 is still one that's relevant. Is there a higher form of human social organization that is likely to displace liberal democracy linked to a market economy? And I really don't see one. I think, I've argued for many years that China came the closest to that. It is stable, or it seems stable, and it's achieved a fairly high level of technological development. But I think that, time will tell whether we're all going to gravitate towards a Chinese form of political organization, political and economic organization, or not. And I have my doubts whether that is actually going to displace liberal democracy in the long run.
Yeah. One thing that I've been thinking about is the question of what would have to happen in global politics over the next few decades to nullify your end of history thesis. So maybe your argument about how liberal democracy is the best form of governance, like the current wave of authoritarianism, does not necessarily nullify your thesis, but maybe something that would nullify your thesis if it turned out that the Chinese economy in a few decades ends up being the most prosperous economy in the world. Would that?
Yeah, I think that would do it.
Yeah. Okay, and then I'm kind of curious, when you talk about how liberal democracy is great because of how much better it is than the other forms of governance, do you view democracy as a means or as an end in and of itself?
Well, it's both. All governments exist to provide security, economic prosperity, stability, to their societies. I think that there's a Republican understanding of democracy that says that also political participation is an end in itself, and that human lives is not something that can be lived to the fullest unless you have a share in your own self-governance at a collective level. And so I think that, if you imagine a society of drones that are basically fed and housed and healthy, but actually don't exercise any autonomous choice in the way that, they live collectively, is that really a full human life that, you would admire and you would want? And I don't think that is the case. I think that actually part of what it means to be a full human being is to have the kind of freedom to participate in your own collective self-government, and that's one of the advantages of living in a democracy.
Do you think there are any main downsides to a democracy compared to other non-democratic forms of government?
Well, it's not so much the democratic part, it's the liberal part. I mean, the liberal part puts constraints on executive power. So any authoritarian regime is going to be able to make decisions more quickly and bigger decisions. So, for example, the kind of changes in China that Deng Xiaoping brought about, where you basically dismantle an entire communist economic system and replace it with a market economy, that simply could not have been done in a liberal society, where you had constraints on the authoritarian power of one leader. And I think this continues to be a complaint that a lot of people have about democracy, that you have to argue, you have to deliberate, you can't fix things very quickly. On the other hand, it is accountable. And the argument in favor of democracy has always been that in the long run, that need for consent of the governed makes, the ultimate form of government that emerges more stable and one that people buy into. Authoritarian regimes can look quite successful in the short run, but they turn out to be very fragile because, in fact, people don't believe in the legitimacy of the government that they have.
Maybe that suggests that part of the reason why there's been a turn towards anti-democratic governments in the West nowadays is because the consent of the governed is trying to tell their elected leaders to break many of the more bureaucratic institutions and barriers that traditionally come with democracy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, you could be right about that. I think in this country there's a lot of frustration that the government doesn't seem to be able to accomplish things the way it once was able to. And the reason I think you get Trumpism or Elon Muskism is that, people want a leader that can just order things to be done and they happen. I think that form of government has got a lot of problems because there are good reasons to operate under a rule of law. But I do think that, it's that kind of unhappiness that has been driving populism in the United States and in other places.
Yeah, and I do find the populism and the authoritarianism in the U.S. to be incredibly fascinating. So yeah, I'd like to talk about it a little bit more. You've written a lot about some of the main causes of the rise of populist figures like Donald Trump in the U.S. But to our audience, what would you say are the main contributing factors to the rise of Trump that you think many people are not fully aware of?
Well, I would point you to a blog post that I just put up about a week ago. I have a blog called Frankly Fukuyama, and I published a little piece called It's the Internet Stupid. So I went through 9 reasons, 9 causes for the rise of populism that have been commonly discussed in all of the, many, many discussions of why we have populism in the United States since 2016. And they include things like economic inequality, nativism, racism, poor leadership on the part of the left, charismatic leadership on the part of demagogues like Trump, so on down the list. And the last one that everybody cites is social media and the internet. And, my argument was that all 9 of these are actually, quite reasonably factors that explain the rise of populism, but the particular form that it's taken and the timing really, I think, have to be driven by that 9th factor, which is, technology, the rise of an online world that allows us to have alternative realities, which really wouldn't have been possible, I think, 30 years ago before the internet, and that the kind of extreme conspiracism that has overtaken, large parts of the American right really, I think, can only exist when, people are heavily online and basically, can be very selective about the sorts of sources of information that they get. In the days when you had, 3 major networks and, a handful of major national newspapers, I don't think you could have gotten the kind of vaccine denialism or, election denialism that we've seen in recent years. So I think that that's actually, so all 9 of those factors are important, but I would say that the character and the timing of the populism that we've seen is very much due to the rise of the internet.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with your blog post about just how large of an impact the internet and social media has had on the rise of Trumpism. But it did get me thinking, because there's another article from a Substack writer that I respect known as Dan Williams, where he makes the argument that, the fact that the internet and the social media ecosystems have played such a large role in right-wing populism is directly because of and not in spite of how democratic countries like the U.S. have become. So I'm just going to quote his piece because I really like to hear your take on it. Quote, "Social media's democratizing nature is the most critical factor in understanding its political effects, including its negative ones. It is precisely because social media has democratized the public sphere that it has contributed to trends liberals are so worried about. For the most part, social media doesn't manipulate good people into accepting bad informations. It simply reveals popular perspectives on reality that elites previously excluded from mainstream discourse, often for good reason. It is this public revelation and normalization of popular ideas that explains social media's most dramatic and dangerous impacts, including its connection to right-wing populism. Outlets like the BBC and the New York Times might subtly select, omit, frame, contextualize, and package reality in misleading ways, but they also typically impose basic standards of professional journalism and exclude many people who have nothing of value to contribute. Social media welcomes those voices into the conversation. More precisely, platforms that have relaxed content moderation policies do that. The result? Deranged conspiracy theories about Jews, medieval discourse about demons and occult forces, the most hyperbolic forms of bigotry imaginable, and countless other popular ideas that were previously excluded from mainstream discourse." End quote. So what do you think of Dan Williams's thesis that the reason why social media has had such a negative effect on right-wing populism is because of how many people believe those opinions in the first place?
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I think that actually a democracy needs a certain amount of elite control over things like, factual information, credibility of information sources, and so forth. I think in a completely democratized information sphere where anyone can say anything, they will, and you're going to get very low-quality information. And so democracy is not an answer to everything. If you're trying to come up with an effective vaccine and anyone can come up with any substance they want and push that as a remedy, you're going to have a lot more disease, right? So I think that all democracies need to rely on expert opinion. I mean, one of the handmaidens of the liberal revolution of the modern Enlightenment was modern natural science. And modern natural science is not a democratic enterprise. It's not an enterprise in which anyone can assert any theory they want It's one that has very strict standards for hypothesis testing, evidence, and the like. And that's, I think, the thing that's been undermined by the rise of the internet.
I do find myself very sympathetic to the arguments that you're postulating right now, but it does make me wonder if you, like, when you say that you do believe that some level of elite control is necessary in society, do you think that that goes against some of the principles of free speech that, like, are so heavily espoused by elites in the first place?
Well, the theory behind free speech is that you're going to have a marketplace of ideas that in the long run is going to lead to better outcomes because people will be able to argue. And if there's not a single, elite that controls the nature of what, factual information is, you're actually going to get better debate. Now, I think that is broadly true, and it's something that we still need to protect. The trouble is that the particular technology that we are dealing with now doesn't provide necessarily a level playing field for all ideas where they can contest with one another and the best one can rise to the surface. You have an extraordinary concentration of power in these internet platforms, and they are driven by things other than searching for, the truth or for the health of the democratic community. They're really driven by a profit motive where, the more clicks they get, the more money they make. And oftentimes what gets the clicks is stuff that's outrageous or edgy or, hostile or, simply untrue. And I think that that's really what's contributed very heavily to the degradation of the quality of information on social media at the present moment.
Do you think that maybe social media is one example of basically liberal democracy giving itself the tools for its own internal contradictions that could lead to its eventual collapse if it isn't stopped in time?
Well, maybe. I'm not quite sure, how you would stop it, but I do think that it does. The technology really is one that I don't think John Stuart Mill or some of the founders of kind of modern liberal theory really had to contend with, and I'm not quite sure what their answer to that would be.
Yeah, but maybe that means that we're in uncharted territory. We deserve to do a lot on our own to figure out what our answers are.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. But look, that's not new. I think every single technology that has come down the pike has posed a threat to to political order. The invention of the printing press really is closely related to the Protestant Revolution and the turmoil that caused in Europe. The rise of radio was used heavily by Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin, as ways of propagating totalitarian ideology. So, it's not as if this is a technological development that's unique in the disruptive effects that it's had on political systems.
There's another facet of social media that I think has been very important in the way that it's affected the livelihood of everyone, including Americans. And I think that it does subtly relate to something that you wrote in The End of History. So I'm going to quote your book again. Quote, "Today in democratic America, there is a host of people who devote their lives to the total and complete elimination of any vestiges of inequality, making sure that no little girl should have to pay more to have her locks cut than a little boy, that no Boy Scout troop should be closed to homosexual scoutmasters, that no building be built without a concrete wheelchair ramp going up the front door. These passions exist in American society because of, and not despite, the smallness of its remaining inequalities." End quote. Do you think social media is a platform that makes people very good at coming up with reasons to be discontent with, like, the small remaining inequalities that exist in society?
I'm not so sure that social media is the guilty party there. Tocqueville, in the old regime and the revolution, talked about the fact that in the period, in the couple of decades before the French Revolution, inequality in France was actually decreasing and that things were getting better. But the problem was that people's expectations for future improvements had grown faster than the actual improvements that they were experiencing. And so I think that this is kind of a universal phenomenon that in periods of rapid social change, our expectations grow, much more rapidly than our ability to actually satisfy those new expectations. And I think that's a lot of the explanation for why we're in the kind of political mess we're in right now. In certain ways, the world has never been better than it is in the year 2025, in terms of equality, prosperity, security, all sorts of things in historical perspective are really looking much better, including, much better than they were in the 1930s and 1970s. They're fairly recent periods when you had higher inflation, you had more inequality, you had more racism, you had, a lot more of a lot of bad things. But because people's expectations for what their society ought to be providing them have gone up, correspondingly faster, they're even more discontented.
Yeah, I do find it so fascinating that Americans are often more discontented now than they were a few decades ago. And I would say that I do think a significant part of that is social media. But I think another part of it relates to what I'm about to ask you. Do you think the U.S. is still a high-trust society?
No, I've written about this. It's definitely fallen off that perch. That was a view that was held by very many people, myself included, I think up until the 1990s. But, there are a lot of empirical measures of trust and confidence in institutions, and those have all been deteriorating, very rapidly. They deteriorated by the 1990s when Robert Putnam wrote his Bowling Alone article and book. And that deterioration, I think, has accelerated since that time. So, yeah, definitely, that's probably one of the biggest challenges and defects of American society and democracy right now is the absence of trust, either horizontal trust between citizens or kind of vertical trust in institutions and in government.
Yeah, and I'm always fascinated to understand why, the U.S. has gradually stopped being a high-trust society. Obviously, I would paint social media as a major culprit, but there's another quote that I would like to give from your book that I think might shed some light. I'm very curious on your take on this. Quote, "The fact that major social inequalities will remain, even in the most perfect of liberal societies, means that there will be a continuing tension between the twin principles of liberty and equality upon which societies are based. This tension, noted clearly by Alexis de Tocqueville, will be as necessary and ineradicable as the inequality out of which it grows. Every effort to give the disadvantaged equal dignity will mean the abridgment of the freedom or rights of other people." End quote. So do you think that there is some kind of tension between trying to pursue full equality and trying to have an extremely high trust society?
Yeah, it's funny. I'd forgotten that I'd written that, but that's actually a pretty good observation. No, I mean, I think you see that right now in the kind of anti-DEI campaign that the Trump administration is waging, right? DEI was put in place in order to close the gaps, between races, between genders, sexual orientations. That's really what political correctness was about. The remaining gaps were not as great as the gaps that existed in the days that we had legal segregation. They're much smaller, but they're still there. And I think that the effort to close them has triggered this enormous backlash. So, the Trump administration is busy trying to stamp out every single DEI program in the entire country. And, that's, itself an expression of the lack, the feeling on the part of the old elites that they no longer have the freedoms that they used to. And so therefore they're constricting the freedoms of other people. So, yeah, I think those two principles are in conflict with one another right now.
So maybe there is some kind of equilibrium upon which trying to pursue equality in terms of having perfect demographic ratios among race lines or gender lines Do you believe that there is a certain extent where trying to focus on it too much leads to the splintering and like increased polarization in a society to the point where it is not worthwhile to do so?
Yeah, although I don't think it's easy to define exactly where that balance point is. But that was the problem with communism. Communism wanted to eliminate class inequality. And as a result, they set up a dictatorship that was, much more comprehensive than the dictatorships that existed, before the modern era. And so you saw that conflict between liberty and equality, all the way back then as well. In fact, in a more stringent way, because, the abolition of private property and the centralization of economies was a much greater exercise of authoritarian power than anything that we've seen lately. And that was all done in the name of equality. Or, the Cultural Revolution in China was, again, an effort to stamp out economic inequality in that society that led to really horrible, outcomes for people.
Okay, then I think this is a nice transition to my next question. My next question is simply, why do you consider yourself to be a liberal and not a leftist? Do you think that leftists focus too much on equality compared to simply...
Well, I don't... it depends. There's a lot of... Leftist, I don't think, defines a clear objective. I would say that in the terminology of the 20th century, I would position myself as a social democrat, meaning that I think that modern liberal democracies need to do a certain amount of redistribution and create social safety nets in terms of education, health, some basic social services, and that was really the winning formula of the 20th century. I think that if you're a more austere and doctrinaire liberal, where you don't want the state to be intervening to soften the blows of, market economies and inequalities, you're going to get a lot of political opposition, because people really resent those inequalities, and they don't like living in a state that, simply leaves people to, take care of themselves with no help from society. So that's really my position. Also, the degree of state intervention you want depends very much actually on your actual context. So what happened in Scandinavia during the 1980s and 90s, they were much more egalitarian societies with much more comprehensive social safety nets than certainly the United States or Britain. But they went too far, and they didn't have sustainable economic or fiscal models, and so they had to, pull back on that. So I think that, I believe in redistribution, but I think that it has to be kept within bounds that are fiscally sustainable in a modern economy.
Yeah, but it is interesting to hear the ways in which you would have considered yourself to be a social democrat in the 90s. So obviously, after Trump was first elected president, there were tons and tons of different theories about what were the main reasons why he got elected. And one theory within elite circles was that it was a product of income inequality and a product of the idea that the U.S.'s welfare state was not large enough and did not do enough to diminish the degree of inequality that was present within the country. Do you think that was properly emphasized as an explanation, or do you think they focused on it too much or too little as an explanatory factor?
It was obviously an explanation for a certain part of the Trump coalition. So he definitely did get a lot of support from people in the old industrial economy whose jobs had been outsourced to China and to other developing countries. So that was definitely part of it. But he also got a lot of support from people that didn't lose their jobs, that were quite comfortably middle class. And there, I think the cultural resentments were, much more powerful than the economic ones. The other argument, I think, that would tend to make you disbelieve the economic inequality piece was that if that was really the driver, then traditional left-wing socialists or social democrats like Bernie Sanders should have done a lot better, because, unlike Trump, he's got a real answer for economic inequality. He wants more redistribution, but that was not a winning position in the 2010s. And that indicates that really what was driving Trump was not the promise of greater equality so much as other things that were often more cultural in nature.
Yeah. So maybe, do you think that those like cultural things in nature, some people might call them the excesses of the social justice movement, do you think that they were grounded in an attempt to make American society more equal and more equitable for marginalized groups?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, to some extent, that was true. I mean, there are certain things that I think we do to help equalize outcomes in society that are both necessary and morally just. I think that there was, however, especially after 2020, excesses in that movement. I think that historically, the Black Lives Matter movement and the kinds of protests that occurred after what's his name in 2020, the guy that was
George Floyd.
After the George Floyd killing, really did push things in a kind of bizarrely extreme direction where, you have the rise of people like Robin DiAngelo and Ibrahim Kendi, who basically said that even if you were perfectly, colorblind liberal, that you were still part of a structure of white supremacy and that you should feel guilty about that. And I think, that kind of thinking and rhetoric really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And I think rightly so, because, the point, I think, as a matter of fact, a lot of ordinary middle-class Americans are not terribly racist, and they're not, supporters of a grand racial or gender, patriarchy or white supremacists. And so I think that kind of language really alienated a lot of people. But, there are also racists and nativists that really don't like, any recognition of those inequalities. And I think there's actually kind of a movement now on the part of the right to, for example, not even want to teach young people the history of slavery and the struggles of the civil rights era, because somehow that's DEI and that's a terrible distortion of American history. And I think that's ridiculous. I think very important for American young people to learn about the actual history of their country.
Yeah. Do you believe that the rise of like the type of social progressivism that you described, which reached its apex in 2020, do you believe that helped contribute to declining social trust in the U.S.?
Among other things, yeah, I think that's probably right. I think that, many social movements work that way. They begin with a just cause, but they overdo it, and that, then creates a reaction, and then things swing back the other way. And in the process, people find themselves fighting among each other much more, and social trust declines.
Yeah. So I guess I do want to switch gears a little bit, because you do mention how like there's been a backlash in the other direction from the right. I think that's incredibly fascinating to discuss, especially in the midst of the authoritarianism that we see present right now. So when it comes to like how like levels of corruption or levels of like illiberalism present within the White House, how bad would you say that it is compared to different periods of American history that you experienced in your own life?
Well, it's a little bit hard to judge that. I do think that people forget what life was like, in some. I'm quite old at this point. I was born in 1952, and I think there's on the right kind of nostalgia for the 1950s. But in the 1950s, a black person could not walk the streets in many parts of downtown Washington, D.C., because it remained a segregated city. If you go back to shows like Mad Men, that describe the office culture of the 1950s, first of all, women, only occupied very subordinate roles as secretaries or typists, and Sexual harassment was not frowned upon. It was actually kind of the norm in that kind of a setting. And there was a lot of inequality internationally. You still had, colonial societies that were under the domination of European powers. You still had not fascist, but you had, very totalitarian communist regimes. So, the world was not a paradise back in the 1950s. And I think people tend to forget, and they don't put into adequate perspective the way in which things actually have gotten a lot better since then.
Does that include like the extent of like President Trump's corruption right now, where even if it's bad, like with respect to the past few presidencies, do you think that it's not that bad in the grand scheme?
I'm not enough of a American historian to really know, but given that, his corruption is now kind of counted in the billions of dollars, it's hard for me to believe that any prior American president has even remotely come close to his level of corruption. And the other thing about it is that earlier presidents who may have been corrupt were embarrassed about it, and he's doing it out in the open. And in a way, that makes it doubly worse, because he's kind of giving the signal that it's okay for any other politician to behave the way he is.
So in your book, The End of History, one thing that you described about the advantages of like liberal democracies is that because their economies were not nearly as corrupt, they could grow at a much, much faster pace than like autocratic or authoritarian countries might. So one thing that a lot of political commentators theorized after Trump was reelected is that his wave of things like corruption or his wave of like anti-free trade tariffs would cause the American economy to contract or do significantly worse than it had been doing previously. Do you have any good explanations for why Trump's tariffs or the extent of Trump's corruption has not caused GDP to sink to the extent that people would have expected?
Well, I think you got to come back and ask that question in a year, because I think there is going to be a deterioration. It's not happened as quickly as a lot of people expected. The corruption part, I wouldn't expect to have any effect at all, because, his personal corruption in the scale of a $27 trillion economy is not going to have any effect. The tariffs have not been as steep as some people expected, but we're now returning to trade war with China, and it could be that, things will look a lot worse in another 6 months. So I think we just have to wait. And then there are other explanations. I think a lot of companies, in anticipation of the tariffs, were stockpiling, supplies earlier in this year, and they're going to run out at a certain point. So I'm not sure that things will be looking as good, And then there's also the possibility of, you could have a big collapse in the stock market. I think one of the big things that's going on right now that's also a big economic mistake is not Trump's fault, but it's this massive overinvestment in AI infrastructure. We're in an AI bubble, and that bubble is going to burst at some point.
There's a quote from I just want to keep quoting your book because I just think it's extremely insightful. But one of the things that's very fascinating about the Soviet Union is that like GDP rates had actually been growing until they stopped growing that well, and then eventually it all fell down like it was a bubble that burst. So I'm going to quote your piece, like your book again. Quote, "Hard as it is to recall now, economic growth had actually been considered a strength of the Soviet state up through the early 1970s. Between 1928 and 1955, Soviet GNP had increased at a yearly rate of 4.4 to 6.3%. But by the mid-1970s, this rate of growth had slowed to a range estimated by the CIA at 2 to 2.3% per annum between 1975 and 1985. Do you see something analogous happening with America's GDP numbers where it's going to continue growing, but give it a year or two and all of a sudden it's just going to like either screech to a halt or just grow at a much, much slower rate?"
I don't think that those are really comparable. The thing about the Soviet statistics that you cited is really a kind of one-off thing, that when you're shifting from a from an agrarian to an industrial economy, and you have a government that is basically just extracting capital from the countryside and putting it into industry, mobilizing millions and millions of workers to come off of the farm and go into factories, you can get extraordinary rates of growth. That also explains China's growth, after they began modernizing in 1978. What we're seeing in the United States is not that, because we went through that phase, 100 years ago. What's going on right now is, I think, just a market bubble. It's just a misallocation of capital based on everybody's, overheated expectations for the returns that AI is going to produce. And we've gone through several of these technology bubbles. There's a telecoms bubble, and there was a dot-com bubble, and there's a subprime mortgage bubble, and this is just the latest of a whole series of bubbles in a mature, information economy.
Yeah, so maybe your take is that, the extent of, the current economic policies that America is pursuing, a lot of them are bad, but they're just normal bad, and they're not, fatal in any way.
Well, except for the tariffs. I mean, I think that, I still believe enough in liberal economics to think that tariffs in the long run are really going to hold growth back. And so that's not, I think, a kind of normal approach. Although, I guess it's true that in the past we have had high tariff rates and have still remained a liberal democracy. But I think that the other stuff about the misallocation of capital through these manias and bubbles, I think that is kind of very normal. And we've experienced several just in the last, 2-3 decades.
Do you think that the fact that there hasn't been a significant recession yet, do you think that is preventing the median American from having a more negative view about Trump than they should? Which is why...
Sure. Obviously, if we're in the midst of a, high inflation and, stagflation, where you had heightened inflation and job loss, people would turn against Trump right away.
Yeah. So then the question is, how much do you think the average American cares about or even fully understands the extent of the democratic backsliding that is occurring in their country?
Well, I think that a lot of ordinary Americans don't follow that. It's kind of an abstract thing. The rule of law is a sort of abstraction. And if it doesn't affect them directly, they're not going to care about it. On the other hand, if they see one of their neighbors snatched off the street by a masked ICE agent, maybe they'll start realizing that actually could affect them personally. But at the moment, I think that concern over basic institutions hasn't really set in.
So what would you recommend to the people that are working within those elite institutions? What would you recommend for for how they can safeguard those institutions if they don't have an extremely high amount of support from the broader populace?
Well, I think you need to inform people what's going on. I also think that, the Democrats, that's who the opposition is right now. The Democratic Party needs a positive agenda for what the country is going to look like if they come back into power. I am a real big fan of the abundance movement. I think that if we could get back to a country that could build things and could engage in big projects, like the moon landings or like the TVA or, any of the infrastructure projects that we successfully engaged in back in the New Deal in the 1930s, I think that would be a very positive development, and it would require, serious reform of the way we currently do business. I think that's the path, out of the kind of Trumpian populism that we've got right now.
Yeah, and I too am a fan of the abundance agenda, especially the ways in which it does deliver a lot of promise to average Americans. But then my question is, if so many of the ways in which institutions are under siege, if a lot of it is abstract and hard to understand, then my question is let's imagine that a Democrat does get elected to the presidency in 2028. Do you think that it would be possible for that president to fully undo all of the institutional damage that Trump has done within just their 4 years in office?
I think that it's going to be hard. We have some experience with that. almost 2 years ago, the liberal opposition won in Poland and unseated the Law and Justice Party, which is a Trumpian kind of populist right-wing party. And it's turned out it's been very difficult to undo that damage because, for example, they replaced a lot of judges with their own people that have protected tenure in their positions. It turned out to be harder to undo some of the legislation that the previous government had introduced, and I think that'll probably happen in the case of the Democrats coming back into power. In other respects, they may actually benefit from the Trumpian precedent because I think executive power is going to be different going into the future. I think that Trump has shown that you can actually fire federal bureaucrats, and I would be surprised if a future Democratic president didn't make use of that ability to go after people they didn't like.
Okay, so let's imagine that like a Democratic president, they get elected in 2028 and they use their ability to fire government bureaucrats to basically just fire all the people that believe that the 2020 election was stolen, something like that. Do you think that might set a bad precedent where like that essentially says that whenever an opposition party gets into power, they just have the tacit right to basically just fire all the government bureaucrats that they don't like, that the opposition...
Yeah, well, so this was the situation that existed under the spoils system in the 19th century, and it ended only with the passage of the Pendleton Act in 1883, where you had requirements, like a civil service exam that were necessary in order to get a job in the federal civil service. And I think that if the Democrats are wise, what they will seek to do is not revenge on the Republicans. I mean, obviously, there are some people that the Republicans have put in place that are so obviously unqualified that they do need to be, fired. But I think that, what I would hope for is that they actually try to restore the merit-based system so that the qualities that you need to get a job in the government are not partisan alignment, but knowledge, skill, education, background. That's the kind of system we should want to restore. Whether a future Democratic president will do that, I don't know.
Okay, so let's say that a Democrat gets elected in 2028, and that Democrat happens to be someone that is a huge fan of the End of History book. So they request to get, they have your phone number on speed dial, and they want to call you every other day for advice. What are some main pieces of advice that you would give them about how to get out of the mess that the country would end up inevitably being?
My opinion is that we need to do a fundamental reform of our civil service. We need to give, bureaucrats much more authority to use common sense and good judgment. We need to get rid of a lot of the rules that constrain them. I do think we need deregulation, but actually deregulating bureaucracy is kind of the first order of business. And so I would, empower our government to actually be able to dream big again, to contemplate things like building Hoover Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge. And you can't do that as long as you're living under this over-regulated regime where, every official feels that they have to comply with a gazillion rules that have been created 2 generations ago that nobody actually cares about. So that's what I would do as a first order of business.
Are there any instances where you would recommend that they engage in either implicitly or explicitly anti-democratic policies, like increasing state power or regulating social media or anything like that in the name of the good?
You can increase government power and authority in democratic ways. It just has to be done under rule of law. So, for example, Franklin Roosevelt used the power of the state. He created all sorts of new agencies to try to get out of the Depression. He exceeded, I think, his legal mandate when he tried to pack the Supreme Court, and he met a lot of opposition, and he wisely backed down. But he still, sought to use government power to do a lot of positive things to get out of the Great Depression. And so I think that it's perfectly possible to increase state authority and to use the government more effectively and stay within the rule of law. We've got plenty of precedents for doing that.
All right. So I guess this might be my last question, but I do think it's an important one. Do you love America? And if so, why?
Well, I mean, it's, yes, of course I love America. And I think the reason, is my own family history, because I think by the end of the civil rights era, we had achieved a society that was based on a rule of law, but was also fundamentally open to, the actual diversity of the people that lived in it, where, a family like mine coming from Japan could think of themselves as American because they believed in American values. And I think we are unique in that respect. I mean, even a lot of European democracies, certainly Japan, Korea, that are also fundamentally democratic, don't allow people to become part of their national community nearly as easily as I think you can in the United States. And I think that's something that's important to hang on to.
Final question. What do you want America to become over the next few years, if not the next decade, so that it can become even more close to the values that you hold dear with regards to like the country and the country's...
Well, I think what I would like to see is for America to return to its former position of being a model for other people that are struggling under corrupt or authoritarian or otherwise very, very dysfunctional political systems. I think that was an important aspect of American power, and it's one that we've thrown away in recent years. And I think that getting that back would be, something that would help not just us, but it would help a lot of other people around the world that, would like to live in a successful liberal democracy.
Francis Fukuyama, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.